The lightning split the Colorado sky like a jagged scar, and Brennan Xander watched from the porch of his ranch house as the storm rolled across the plains with the fury of something unleashed. He'd stopped praying for anything meaningful years ago, stopped hoping that his solitary life might transform into something more than endless days of cattle and dust. At 32, he'd resigned himself to the truth that some men were simply meant to walk alone, and he'd made his peace with it. Or so he told himself during the long nights when the silence pressed against his chest like a physical weight. The rain came suddenly, torrential sheets that turned the world gray and formless. Brennan pulled his hat lower and squinted into the distance, toward the road that wound through his property toward Georgetown 3 miles west. That's when he saw her, a figure stumbling through the downpour, clutching something to her chest. His heart kicked against his ribs, instinct overriding the isolation he'd cultivated. He grabbed his oilskin coat and ran into the storm. She collapsed just as he reached her, her knees buckling. Brennan caught her before she hit the mud, and up close he could see she was young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair plastered to her pale face and eyes that rolled back with exhaustion. She was soaked through, her green traveling dress torn at the hem, and she was shaking so violently he could feel it through his coat. "I've got you," he said, lifting her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and that scared him more than anything. "You're safe now." He carried her back to the house, kicking the door open and bringing her inside. The fire was still burning in the hearth, and he laid her on the thick rug in front of it, grabbing blankets from the chest by the wall. Her lips were blue, her breathing shallow and rapid. "Can you hear me?" he asked, wrapping the blankets around her. "Miss, can you tell me your name?" Her eyes fluttered open, and they were the color of spring grass, bright and alive despite her condition. "Felicity," she whispered. "Felicity James. Brennan Xander. This is my ranch. You're about 3 miles from Georgetown." He pressed his hand to her forehead and cursed softly. She was burning up despite the chills racking her body. "How long were you out in that storm?" "Hours," she managed. "My horse threw me when the thunder started. I walked until I couldn't anymore." He moved quickly, years of living alone making him efficient. He heated water on the stove, found clean cloths, and brought her tea laced with whiskey. She tried to sit up, and he helped her, supporting her back while she sipped the hot liquid. Color was slowly returning to her face, but she was still trembling. "Where were you headed?" Brennan asked, settling back on his heels to give her space. "Georgetown. My aunt lives there, Martha Connolly. She runs the boarding house on Main Street." Felicity's voice was stronger now, though still rough. "I was coming from Denver. My father died 2 months ago, and there was nothing left for me there. Aunt Martha said I could stay with her, help her with the boarding house." "I know Martha. Good woman." Brennan stood and walked to the window, watching the storm continue its assault. "You won't be going anywhere tonight. That road's going to be a river of mud, and you need rest." He saw her stiffen, saw the wariness enter her eyes, and he understood immediately. A young woman alone with a strange man in a house miles from town. He turned to face her, keeping his distance. "I'll sleep in the barn," he said quietly. "You take my bed upstairs. There's a lock on the door if it makes you feel safer. In the morning I'll take you to your aunt." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because she relaxed slightly, though her fingers still clutched the blanket. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." "The storm would have killed you," he said bluntly. "Another hour and you'd have been done." She shivered again, but this time it wasn't from cold. Brennan found himself studying her face, the delicate lines of her jaw, the way her hair was starting to dry in soft waves around her shoulders. She was beautiful in a quiet way that made his chest ache with something he'd thought long dead. He showed her to his room, bringing up fresh water and more blankets. She paused in the doorway, looking up at him with those remarkable eyes. "You're very kind," she said. "Most men wouldn't have run out into a storm like that." "Most men aren't as lonely as I am," he replied before he could stop himself. The words hung between them, raw and honest, and he felt heat rise to his face. "Get some rest, Miss James." He turned and left before she could respond, heading down to gather what he needed for the barn. But as he stood in the rain again, walking toward the shelter where his horses waited, he couldn't shake the image of her face, or the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in the landscape of his carefully ordered solitude. The storm raged through the night, and Brennan lay awake in the hay, listening to the thunder and thinking about the woman sleeping in his bed. He'd given up on finding someone years ago after Sarah Mitchell had chosen the banker's son over him, after watching all his friends marry and start families while he remained alone. He'd convinced himself he preferred it, the quiet and the independence. But now, with Felicity James under his roof, he felt the walls he'd built begin to crack. Morning came soft and golden, the storm having washed the world clean. Brennan returned to the house to find Felicity already awake, standing in his kitchen with her hair braided over one shoulder and wearing one of his shirts over her dress. She'd attempted to make coffee, and the smell filled the small space. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing to the shirt. "My dress was still damp." "Keep it," he said, his voice rougher than intended. Seeing her in his clothes did something to him, made him imagine things he had no right imagining. "How are you feeling?" "Better. Embarrassed, mostly. I must have looked like a drowned cat." "You looked like someone who needed help." He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter, studying her in the morning light. She had freckles across her nose, he noticed, and her eyes were even brighter than he remembered. "Your aunt will be worried. We should head out soon." But Felicity was looking around the house with curiosity, taking in the neat but sparse furnishings, the books stacked on a table, the single chair by the fire. "You live here alone?" "For 5 years now. My parents left me this place when they moved to California. My father's lungs couldn't take the mountain air anymore. It must get lonely." He met her gaze. "It does." The honesty between them felt dangerous, like standing too close to a cliff edge. Brennan set down his coffee and moved toward the door. "I'll hitch up the wagon." The ride to Georgetown was quiet at first, both of them watching the landscape roll past. The mountains rose dramatic and snow capped to the west, and the valley stretched green and endless to the east. It was beautiful country, harsh and giving in equal measure, and Brennan had learned to love it despite its challenges. "Tell me about your father," he said eventually, surprising himself with the question. Felicity was silent for a long moment. "He was a carpenter, a good one. But after my mother died when I was 15, he started drinking. By the end, there was nothing left, no money, no clients, just bottles and regret." Her voice was steady, but he could hear the pain underneath. "I tried to help him, but you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I learned a long time ago that life doesn't give you what you deserve. It just gives you what it gives you, and you have to figure out what to do with it." Brennan glanced at her, struck by the strength in her words. She'd clearly been through hell, but there was no bitterness in her voice, just a quiet acceptance that spoke of deep resilience. "What about you?" she asked. "Why are you out here alone? A man who runs into storms to help strangers doesn't seem like the type who'd choose solitude." He considered lying, deflecting, but something about her openness demanded the same from him. "I loved a woman once, Sarah Mitchell. I thought she loved me too, but when it came time to choose, she picked someone else, someone with more money, more prospects. After that, I told myself I was better off alone." "And are you?" The question hung in the air between them. Brennan tightened his grip on the reins. "I was, until yesterday." He felt her eyes on him, felt the weight of what he'd just admitted. The wagon rolled on, and neither of them spoke, but the silence was charged with something electric and new. Georgetown came into view as they crested the hill. A collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street that had been carved from the wilderness with determination and sweat. It was a mining town, born from the silver rush, and it still had the raw energy of a place on the edge of civilization. Brennan guided the wagon down the muddy street toward Martha Connolly's boarding house, a 3-story structure painted white with green shutters. Martha herself came rushing out when she saw them, a sturdy woman in her 50s with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Felicity, thank God. When you didn't arrive yesterday, I thought the worst." Felicity climbed down from the wagon and was immediately enveloped in her aunt's embrace. Brennan watched the reunion, feeling suddenly out of place, like an intruder on something private. He started to turn the wagon around, ready to leave, when Martha called out to him. "Brennan Xander, you stay right there. I need to thank you properly." He climbed down reluctantly, and Martha gripped his arm with surprising strength. "Felicity told me what you did running out into that storm. You saved her life. Anyone would have done the same." "That's not true, and you know it." Martha's eyes were shrewd as they moved between him and her niece. "Come inside. The least I can do is feed you breakfast." The boarding house was warm and smelled of fresh bread and coffee. Martha's guests had already eaten and gone about their business, leaving the dining room empty. Brennan sat at the long table while Martha bustled around the kitchen, and Felicity excused herself to change into dry clothes. When she returned, wearing a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes, Brennan felt his breath catch. She'd left her hair down and it fell in soft waves past her shoulders. She caught him staring and smiled, a shy thing that made his heart stutter. Martha served eggs and bacon and fresh biscuits, talking the whole time about Georgetown and its inhabitants, filling Felicity in on the town gossip. Brennan ate quietly, content to listen and watch Felicity's face light up as she reconnected with her aunt. But he was acutely aware of every time her knee brushed his under the table, every time her fingers came close to his as they reached for the same dish. "So what's your plan, Brennan?" Martha asked suddenly, fixing him with that penetrating stare. "Are you going to pretend you don't have feelings for my niece, or are we going to be honest about what's happening here?" "Aunt Martha." Felicity's face flushed crimson. Brennan set down his fork, heat creeping up his neck. "With all due respect, madam, I only just met her yesterday." "And yet you're looking at her like she hung the moon." Martha leaned back in her chair, satisfied. "I've known you since you were a boy, Brennan. I've watched you close yourself off these past years, watched you turn into a hermit out on that ranch. Then you show up here with my niece and you're actually alive again." The silence that followed was deafening. Brennan couldn't look at Felicity, couldn't bear to see rejection or worse, pity in her eyes. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I should go. I've got cattle to tend to." He was halfway to the door when Felicity's voice stopped him. "Will you come back?" He turned slowly. She was standing now too, her hands clasped in front of her, and there was something in her expression that made hope flare painfully in his chest. "You want me to?" he asked. "Yes." The single word was barely a whisper, but it was enough. Brennan felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been wound tight for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. "Then I'll come back," he said. "Tomorrow, if that's all right with you, Martha." Martha waved her hand dismissively. "Come whenever you like. Someone needs to show Felicity around town, and it might as well be you." The next weeks fell into a pattern that felt both natural and extraordinary. Brennan would finish his work on the ranch and ride into Georgetown, and Felicity would be waiting. usually on the porch of the boarding house with a smile that made the long ride worthwhile. They walked the streets together, and he showed her the general store, the church, the schoolhouse where children's laughter rang out across the valley. They climbed the hills behind town and looked out over the landscape, and she told him about her childhood, about the books she loved to read, and the dreams she'd had before life had worn her down. He told her things he'd never told anyone, about the loneliness that had eaten at him, about the nights when he'd considered selling the ranch and moving somewhere new just to escape the weight of his isolation. She listened without judgment, her hand finding his as they sat on a sun-warmed rock, and the touch felt like coming home. "I gave up," he admitted one afternoon as they walked along Clear Creek, the water rushing over smooth stones beside them. "I gave up believing I'd find someone to share my life with. I thought God had forgotten about me, or maybe I'd done something to deserve being alone." Felicity stopped walking and turned to face him, the sunlight catching in her hair. "And now you appeared in that storm like an answer to prayer." He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Like maybe I was wrong about being forgotten." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. "I gave up too. After watching my father destroy himself, after being turned away by people I thought were friends because we had no money, I stopped believing in good things. And then you ran into a storm for me." "I'd do it again," he said fiercely. 1,000 times over." The kiss happened naturally, inevitably, like the sun rising or the seasons turning. He cupped her face in his hands and leaned down, and she rose up to meet him. And when their lips touched, it was gentle and searching and full of all the hope they'd both abandoned. She tasted like summer and possibility, and he pulled her closer, deepening the kiss until they were both breathless. When they broke apart, her eyes were shining with tears. "I'm falling in love with you," she whispered. "I know it's too soon. I know we barely know each other, but I can't help it." "It's not too soon," he said, resting his forehead against hers. "I've been falling since the moment I saw you in that storm, since the moment you opened your eyes and looked at me like I was someone worth seeing." They stood there by the creek, wrapped in each other's arms while the water rushed past, and the mountains stood silent witness to the beginning of something neither of them had dared to hope for. But Georgetown was a small town, and small towns had long memories and longer tongues. By the time Brennan walked Felicity back to the boarding house, people were whispering. He heard the comments, saw the looks, the mixture of curiosity and speculation that followed them down Main Street. "Let them talk," Felicity said, squeezing his hand. "I don't care what they think." But he cared, not for himself but for her. He knew how cruel gossip could be, how it could turn and twist and destroy. He'd seen it happen to others, women especially, their reputations shredded by wagging tongues and malicious intent. That evening, Martha pulled him aside as he was leaving. "You need to make your intentions clear," she said bluntly. "People are going to assume things, and Felicity's been through enough without becoming the subject of scandalous gossip." "I intend to marry her," Brennan said, the words coming out before he'd fully formed the thought. But as soon as he said them, he knew they were true. "If she'll have me." Martha's stern expression softened into something almost tender. "Then you'd better ask her properly, and soon." He rode back to the ranch that night with his heart pounding and his mind racing. Marry Felicity. Build a life with her. Fill the empty house with laughter and love, and all the things he'd stopped letting himself want. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. He spent the next day working like a man possessed, cleaning the house from top to bottom, fixing loose boards and oiling hinges. He rode into Georgetown in the late afternoon and stopped at the jeweler's shop, a tiny establishment run by an old German immigrant named Klaus Werner. "I need a ring," Brennan said without preamble. Klaus looked up from the watch he was repairing, his thick eyebrows rising. For Felicity James, I presume? The whole town is talking about you two. Then let's give them something worth talking about. Klaus smiled and pulled out a tray of rings. Brennan looked them over carefully, rejecting the ornate ones, the ones with too many stones or too much decoration. Then he saw it, a simple gold band with a single small diamond that caught the light like a captured star. It was perfect, understated and beautiful, just like her. "That one," he said, pointing. He rode to the boarding house with the ring burning a hole in his pocket. Felicity was in the garden behind the house, hanging laundry on the line. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and her face lit up with a smile that made everything else fall away. "You're early," she said, setting down the basket. "I wasn't expecting you until after dinner. I couldn't wait." He took her hands, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been since he was a boy. "Felicity, I know we haven't known each other long. By any reasonable measure, this is too fast, too soon. But I also know that from the moment I carried you out of that storm, my life changed. You changed it. You made me remember what it feels like to hope, to want something more than just getting through another day." Her eyes were wide, her lips parted in surprise. He dropped to one knee, right there in the garden with the wet laundry flapping in the breeze, and pulled out the ring. "Felicity James, will you marry me? Will you share my life, my home, all the days I have left? I promise I'll spend every one of them trying to make you happy." Tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling, that brilliant smile that made his heart soar. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, Brennan, I'll marry you." He stood and swept her into his arms, kissing her deeply while she laughed and cried against his mouth. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, like it had been made for her, like she'd been made for him. Martha came out and found them like that, wrapped around each other in the garden, and she didn't say a word, just smiled and went back inside to give them privacy. They stayed there until the sun started to set, talking about the future, about the life they'd build together. Felicity wanted to plant a garden at the ranch, wanted to fill the rooms with furniture and color. Brennan wanted to expand the house, add a proper second story with big windows that looked out over the valley. "I want children," Felicity said quietly, her head resting against his chest. "Lots of them. I want the house to be full of noise and love." "Then that's what we'll have," he promised, kissing the top of her head. "Everything you want, I'll give you." They decided on a short engagement, neither of them seeing the point in waiting. The wedding was set for 3 weeks away, just enough time to make the necessary arrangements. The whole town turned out for it, cramming into the small white church on the edge of Georgetown. Brennan stood at the altar in his best suit, his hands shaking slightly as he waited for Felicity to appear. When she did, walking down the aisle on Martha's arm in a simple white dress with wildflowers in her hair, he forgot how to breathe. She was radiant, glowing with happiness, and when she reached him and took his hand, he knew with absolute certainty that this was right, that every lonely year, every disappointment had been leading him to this moment. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. They spoke their vows with voices that shook with emotion, promising to love and honor each other through whatever came. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Brennan kissed her with all the love and gratitude pouring through him, and the congregation erupted in applause. The reception was held at the boarding house, spilling out into the street as more and more people came to wish them well. There was music and dancing and food that seemed never ending. Brennan danced with his wife, holding her close and marveling at the word. His wife, Felicity Xander. She'd taken his name, and hearing it made something fierce and protective rise up in him. As the evening wore on and the celebration showed no signs of slowing, they slipped away quietly, climbing into Brennan's wagon for the ride back to the ranch. The night was clear and cool, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on velvet. Felicity sat close to him, her head on his shoulder, and they didn't need words. The contentment between them was absolute. The ranch house looked different when they arrived, and it took Brennan a moment to realize that Martha and some of the other women had been there earlier, decorating. There were flowers on the porch, candles glowing in the windows, making the whole place look warm and welcoming instead of lonely and stark. He lifted Felicity down from the wagon, and then, without warning, swept her up into his arms. She laughed, throwing her arms around his neck as he carried her across the threshold and into their home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Xander," he said, setting her down gently in the middle of the room. "It's perfect," she breathed, looking around with shining eyes. "Everything is perfect." That night, they came together with a tenderness and passion that felt like a promise being kept. He loved her slowly, carefully, learning the landscape of her body with reverent hands and lips. She was shy at first but grew bolder as the night went on, matching his intensity with her own. When they finally collapsed together, tangled in sheets in each other, Brennan felt complete in a way he'd never imagined possible. "I love you," he whispered into the darkness, holding her close. "God, Felicity, I love you so much." "I love you too," she replied, her voice drowsy and content. "Thank you for finding me in that storm. Thank you for letting me." The weeks that followed were a revelation. Brennan had lived alone for so long he'd forgotten what it was like to share space with someone, to have another person's rhythms and habits woven into his daily life. Felicity transformed the ranch house with small touches, curtains in the windows, rugs on the floors, books arranged on shelves she convinced him to build. She planted the garden she'd dreamed of, vegetables and flowers side by side, and he helped her dig and weed in the evenings after his work was done. They fell into an easy partnership, each learning what the other needed without being asked. She'd have coffee ready when he came in from the morning chores, and he'd draw her a bath in the evenings so she could soak away the day's tiredness. They cooked together, ate together, worked together, and every night they fell into bed exhausted and happy, reaching for each other in the darkness. 3 months after the wedding, Felicity announced she was pregnant. Brennan was repairing a fence when she came running across the field, her skirts hiked up and her face flushed with excitement and nerves. "I'm going to have a baby," she said breathlessly. "Brennan, we're going to have a baby." He dropped the hammer and grabbed her, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around while she shrieked with laughter. "Are you sure? Are you certain?" The doctor confirmed it this morning. "He says everything looks healthy." She cupped his face in her hands, her eyes searching his. "Are you happy?" "Happy." He set her down carefully, his hands moving to her still flat stomach. "Felicity, I'm beyond happy. I'm terrified and thrilled, and I don't have words for what I'm feeling right now." She laughed, tears spilling over. "That's exactly how I feel." They spent the rest of the day making plans, talking about names and where to put the cradle, and how they'd need to add on to the house sooner rather than later. Brennan found himself praying again for the first time in years, offering up thanks to whoever was listening for the incredible gift he'd been given. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Felicity was sick in the mornings for the first few months. Brennan hovered anxiously, bringing her ginger tea and crackers, holding her hair back when she couldn't keep anything down. Martha came out to the ranch regularly to check on them, bringing her vast knowledge of childbirth and pregnancy, offering advice and reassurance. As Felicity's belly grew, Brennan became increasingly protective. He didn't want her lifting anything heavy or climbing ladders, or doing any of the 100 things she insisted she was perfectly capable of doing. They argued about it good-naturedly, her accusing him of treating her like she was made of glass, him countering that he was simply taking care of what was precious to him. "You're driving me crazy," she said one afternoon, glaring at him as he tried to stop her from hanging curtains. "I'm pregnant, not dying. I know that. I just don't want anything to happen to you." Her expression softened and she took his hand, placing it on her swollen belly. "Feel that. That's our baby, strong and healthy. I'm strong and healthy. You have to let me live, Brennan." He felt the flutter of movement under his palm and was overcome with emotion. "I'm sorry. I'm just scared. I've never been this happy, and it terrifies me that something could take it away." "Nothing is going to take this away," she said firmly. "We're a family now, and we're going to stay that way." Winter came early that year, snow blanketing the valley in November. Brennan worked long hours making sure the cattle were secure, that they had enough hay stored up, that the house was weatherproofed against the cold. Felicity was huge now, moving slowly and complaining about her aching back, but she was radiant, glowing with an inner light that made her more beautiful than ever. The baby came in late January during another storm, as if echoing the circumstances of their meeting. Brennan paced the downstairs while Martha and the midwife attended to Felicity upstairs. He could hear her cries, could hear the low murmur of the women's voices, and he felt utterly helpless. Hours passed, the storm intensifying outside, and he prayed harder than he ever had, begging for both of them to be all right. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he heard it. A baby's cry, strong and healthy, piercing through the storm. He was at the bottom of the stairs when Martha appeared, smiling. "You have a son," she said. "A beautiful, healthy boy, and Felicity is fine, tired but fine." Brennan took the stairs 3 at a time. Felicity was propped up in bed, her hair damp with sweat, looking exhausted and triumphant. And in her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. His son. "Come meet your boy," she said softly. He approached slowly, almost reverently. The baby had dark hair and a red, scrunched-up face, his little fists waving in the air. Brennan reached out with one finger and the baby grabbed it, holding on with surprising strength. "He's perfect," Brennan whispered, his voice thick with tears. "You're both perfect." "We're calling him Benjamin," Felicity said. "Benjamin James Xander, do you like it?" "I love it." He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, unable to take his eyes off his son. "I love everything about this, about us. I never knew I could feel like this." They spent that night as a family, the storm raging outside while they stayed warm and safe inside. Benjamin nursed and slept and cried, and Brennan and Felicity took turns holding him, marveling at the tiny miracle they'd created. When Martha finally convinced Brennan to get some rest, he lay down beside his wife and son, his arm around them both, and felt peace settle over him like a benediction. The years that followed were full and rich. Benjamin grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his mother's eyes and his father's quiet determination. 2 years after his birth, Felicity gave them a daughter, Emma Rose, who was loud and demanding and utterly fearless. Brennan expanded the house as promised, adding rooms and a proper second story, and the place rang with children's laughter and the chaos of family life. The ranch prospered under Brennan's careful management, and Georgetown grew around them, evolving from a rough mining town into a proper community. Brennan and Felicity became pillars of that community, hosting barn dances and helping new families get established. Martha remained a constant presence, doting on her great niece and nephew, telling anyone who would listen about how she'd known from the start that Brennan and Felicity were meant to be. On their 5th anniversary, Brennan took Felicity back to the spot where he'd found her in the storm. It was a clear summer day, nothing like that violent night, but the memory hung between them, precious and profound. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't found you?" he asked, holding her hand as they looked out over the valley. All the time, she admitted. I think about how close I came to dying, to never knowing you or this life or our children. It terrifies me. Me too. He pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. But you didn't die. You lived, and you came into my life like an answer to a prayer I didn't even know I was saying. We saved each other, she said simply. You saved me from that storm, and I saved you from loneliness. That's what love is, isn't it? Saving each other over and over again. He turned her to face him, cupping her face in his hands the way he had that first day by the creek. I would choose you every time. In every storm, in every life, in every possible world. You're my answer, Felicity. You always will be. They kissed there on the hillside, the same deep kiss that had sealed their fate years before. And when they broke apart, they walked back to the ranch hand in hand, back to their children and their life and their future, grateful beyond measure for the storm that had brought them together. More years passed, marked by birthdays and holidays and the steady progression of seasons. Benjamin started school and showed an aptitude for numbers that delighted Brennan. Emma learned to ride before she could barely walk, fearlessly galloping around the ranch on a pony Brennan bought despite Felicity's protests. They added another son, Thomas, and then one more daughter, Sarah, named for the woman Brennan had once loved, a gesture that showed how completely he'd healed from that old wound. The ranch continued to thrive, becoming one of the most successful operations in the valley. Brennan hired help as the work grew beyond what he could manage alone, and he found satisfaction in providing jobs and stability to other families. Felicity's garden became legendary, producing vegetables and flowers in such abundance that she sold the surplus in town, saving the money for their children's futures. They had hard times too, of course. There was the winter when half their herd died in a blizzard, the summer when drought threatened everything they'd built. Benjamin broke his arm falling from a tree, and Emma came down with scarlet fever that had them both sick with worry until she finally recovered. But they faced it all together, their love deepening and strengthening with each challenge overcome. On their 10th anniversary, Brennan surprised Felicity with a trip to Denver. Martha came to stay with the children, and they spent 3 days in the city, staying in a fancy hotel and eating in restaurants and attending a theater performance. It was glamorous and exciting, but both of them were relieved to return home, to their children and their ranch and the life they'd built from nothing. I don't need fancy things, Felicity said as they lay in bed that first night back, listening to the familiar sounds of home. I just need you and our family. Good, Brennan replied, pulling her closer, because I plan on keeping you for at least another 50 years. Only 50, she laughed, that bright sound that still made his heart leap. I was hoping for forever. Forever then, he agreed. Forever and then some. As the children grew older, they began to take on more responsibilities around the ranch. Benjamin, at 12, was already a skilled horseman and could handle many of the daily chores. Emma, at 10, had her mother's green thumb and took over much of the garden work. The younger two were still small but eager to help in whatever ways they could. Felicity found time to start teaching some of the younger children in Georgetown, holding classes in the church basement twice a week. She had a gift for it, making learning fun and accessible, and soon she had a dozen students hanging on her every word. Brennan would watch her with those children and fall in love with her all over again, seeing the kindness and patience she brought to everything she did. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, Benjamin came out and sat between them. "Papa," he said seriously, "how did you know Mama was the one? How did you know you wanted to marry her?" Brennan exchanged a glance with Felicity, seeing the smile playing at her lips. Well, son, it's complicated and simple at the same time. When I found your mother in that storm, something just clicked into place. It was like I'd been walking around with a piece of myself missing, and suddenly it was there. But you only just met her, Benjamin protested. How could you know so fast? Sometimes you just know, Felicity said gently. Your father didn't give up on me even when things were hard. He chose to love me, and he keeps choosing it every single day. That's what marriage is, Benjamin. It's choosing each other, over and over. Benjamin nodded thoughtfully, absorbing this information with the seriousness he brought to everything. I hope I find someone like that someday. You will, Brennan assured him. And when you do, don't let fear hold you back. Take the chance, even if it's terrifying. The boy went back inside, leaving them alone again. Felicity leaned her head on Brennan's shoulder and he wrapped his arm around her, marveling as he always did at the simple perfection of this moment. We did good, she said quietly. With the children, with this life. We did really good. We did, he agreed. And we're not done yet. The years continued their steady march. They celebrated Benjamin's 16th birthday with a big party, the whole town turning out to mark his transition toward manhood. Emma announced she wanted to be a teacher like her mother, and Felicity began training her, the two of them spending hours working on lesson plans and teaching techniques. Thomas showed an interest in ranching that pleased Brennan immensely, following his father around and asking endless questions about cattle and horses and land management. Little Sarah, at 6, was still figuring out her place, but showed signs of having her father's head for numbers. Martha passed away peacefully in her sleep when Felicity was 33, and they mourned her deeply. She'd been the one constant link to Felicity's past, the bridge between who she'd been and who she'd become. They buried her in the Georgetown cemetery with half the town in attendance, and Brennan held Felicity while she cried, offering the same steady support she'd always given him. But life moved forward, as it always did. The boarding house passed to a cousin, and Felicity made sure her aunt's memory was honored there. They established a scholarship in Martha's name for young women who wanted to pursue teaching, and it became one of Felicity's proudest accomplishments. On their 15th anniversary, they took all the children on a camping trip into the mountains. They spent 3 days under the stars, fishing in cold streams and cooking over open fires, telling stories and singing songs. On the last night, with the children asleep in their tents, Brennan and Felicity sat by the fire holding hands. You remember that first night, she asked. When you brought me to the ranch and slept in the barn, of course. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about you up in the house, wondering if you were warm enough, if you were scared. I was scared, she admitted, but not of you. I was scared of how immediately I felt connected to you, like I'd known you forever. It didn't make sense. It still doesn't, Brennan said, squeezing her hand. But I've stopped trying to understand it. Some things are just meant to be. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to embers. Around them, the mountains stood eternal and protective, and overhead the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns. In that moment, Brennan felt the weight of his contentment, the fullness of a life well lived. I love you, he said, the words as true as they'd been the first time he'd spoken them. Thank you for appearing in that storm. Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for running into it, she replied. Thank you for being brave enough to choose love when you'd given up hoping for it. The fire died down, and they banked the coals before heading to their own tent. Inside, wrapped in blankets and each other, they made love with the quiet passion of long familiarity, each knowing exactly how to bring the other pleasure. Afterward, Felicity fell asleep in his arms, and Brennan lay awake listening to her breathe, counting his blessings one by one. More years passed. each one adding to the rich tapestry of their life together. Benjamin, at 18, announced his intention to attend college in Denver to study accounting. Brennan was proud and heartbroken in equal measure, but he helped his son pack and drove him to the train station, offering advice and encouragement. "Make us proud," he said, gripping Benjamin's shoulder. "But more importantly, make yourself proud." "I will, Papa. I learned from the best." Emma, at 16, was already teaching her own classes and showed every sign of being an even better educator than her mother. Thomas, at 14, was Brennan's shadow, learning everything he could about running the ranch. And Sarah, at 10, had developed a love of drawing and filled the house with sketches of horses and mountains and family portraits. Felicity, at 38, was as beautiful as ever in Brennan's eyes. There were lines around her eyes now, silver threads in her dark hair, but she moved with the same grace and spoke with the same warmth that had captivated him from the beginning. They'd settled into the deep comfort of a long marriage, knowing each other so completely that words were often unnecessary. One spring morning, as they worked together in the expanded garden, Felicity straightened suddenly and pressed her hand to her stomach. "What's wrong?" Brennan was at her side immediately, concern flooding through him. She looked up at him with a mixture of surprise and delight. "I think I'm pregnant again." "What? But you're—" He stopped himself, not wanting to say she was too old, though at 38 it was certainly unusual. "I know," she laughed. "I thought we were done, but it seems life has one more surprise for us." The pregnancy was harder than the others had been, her body not bouncing back as easily as it had in her 20s. Brennan was anxiously attentive, perhaps even more so than with their first child, and she tolerated his hovering with patient amusement. The children were excited about having a new sibling, even Benjamin writing enthusiastic letters from college. The baby arrived in late winter, another boy they named Michael. He was healthy and loud, and his arrival seemed to breathe new energy into the household. Sarah was particularly taken with her baby brother, constantly wanting to hold him and help care for him. Thomas joked that they'd have to teach Michael ranching from birth to catch up to all the knowledge he'd have to learn. Brennan held his youngest son and felt the familiar surge of love and protectiveness. He was 44 now, old enough to be a grandfather by some standards, but he'd never felt more alive. Looking at Felicity nursing their baby, surrounded by their other children, he was overwhelmed with gratitude for the life they'd built. As Michael grew, the older children began leaving home one by one. Benjamin graduated college and took a position with a bank in Denver, though he came home regularly to visit. Emma married a schoolteacher from a neighboring town when she was 21, and Brennan walked her down the aisle with tears streaming down his face. Thomas took over more and more of the ranch operations, proving himself a capable and thoughtful manager. Sarah, at 17, announced she wanted to go to art school in San Francisco. This was harder for Brennan to accept than even Benjamin leaving had been. His baby girl, moving so far away to pursue something as uncertain as art. But Felicity talked him through it, reminding him that they'd always encouraged their children to follow their dreams. "She has talent," Felicity said firmly. "Real talent. We can't hold her back just because we'll miss her." So they sent Sarah off with their blessing and enough money to support her studies. The house felt emptier with just the three of them and Michael, now a rambunctious 7-year-old. But it also felt peaceful, like they were coming full circle to where they'd started. On their 20th anniversary, Brennan took Felicity back to Georgetown for dinner at the hotel restaurant. As they ate and talked and laughed, he reached across the table and took her hand. 20 years, he said wonderingly. It feels like yesterday and forever at the same time. I know exactly what you mean. She laced her fingers through his. Sometimes I still see that storm in my dreams. I see myself walking through it, thinking I was going to die. And then I see you running toward me and I wake up so grateful I could cry. I have that dream too, he admitted. Except in mine, I don't reach you in time. I watch you fall and I can't get there fast enough. It always wakes me up terrified. But you did reach me. You saved me and we built this beautiful life together. That's what's real, Brennan, not the nightmares, but this. She gestured between them, encompassing everything they'd created. They finished dinner and walked through Georgetown arm in arm. The town had changed significantly over the years, growing more refined and civilized. Electric lights were being installed, and there was talk of paving the main street. But some things remained the same. The church where they'd married, the boarding house where they'd fallen in love, the mountains standing eternal watch. You ever regret it? Brennan asked as they stood looking up at the stars. Marrying me so quickly, binding yourself to this life. Felicity turned to him, her eyes fierce in the lamplight. Never. Not once, not for a single second. You're my greatest blessing, Brennan Xander. You and our children and this life we've made. If I could go back and do it all again, I wouldn't change a thing. He kissed her there on the street, not caring who might see, pouring 20 years of love and devotion into the gesture. When they broke apart, she was smiling, that brilliant smile that had captured his heart in the first place. The years continued their steady progression. Michael grew into a thoughtful boy who loved reading as much as ranching, often found with a book tucked into his back pocket as he worked. Thomas married a local girl and they had children of their own, making Brennan and Felicity grandparents for the first time. Emma's students continued to thrive under her guidance, and several went on to college thanks to her encouragement. Sarah's art began gaining recognition, and she had a show in San Francisco that Brennan and Felicity traveled to attend, bursting with pride at their daughter's success. Benjamin became a partner in his bank and married a kind woman who reminded Brennan pleasantly of Felicity. As they moved into their 50s, Brennan and Felicity found themselves with more time together. The ranch practically ran itself with Thomas managing the day-to-day operations and Michael helping when he wasn't in school. They took long walks in the evenings, visited their children and grandchildren regularly, and spent quiet nights by the fire reading or simply enjoying each other's company. "We should write it down," Felicity said one evening, "our story, so the grandchildren know how we met, how we built this life. You think they'd be interested?" "Of course they would. It's a love story, Brennan, a real one, not something from a book. They should know that real love exists, that it's worth fighting for." So they began writing their story together, taking turns with the pen, correcting and adding to each other's memories. It became a project that consumed them pleasantly, bringing back moments they'd half forgotten, making them laugh and cry and hold each other close. When it was finished, they had a leather-bound volume filled with their history, a legacy for future generations. On their 30th anniversary, they gathered all their children and grandchildren at the ranch for a massive celebration. The house and yard were full of family, 3 generations of Xanders running and playing and filling the air with noise and joy. Brennan stood on the porch watching it all, Felicity beside him, and felt his heart might burst from happiness. "Look what we made," she said softly. "All of this from one storm and one moment of bravery. From you appearing like an answer to prayer," he corrected. "I'd given up, Felicity. I'd resigned myself to being alone. And then there you were, and everything changed." She leaned into him, and he wrapped his arm around her waist, holding her close. They watched their family together, watched Thomas toss his squealing children into the air, watched Emma and her husband teaching the older grandchildren to dance, watched Benjamin deep in conversation with his serious-minded son, watched Sarah sketching the whole scene in her ever-present notebook, watched Michael, now 17 and on the cusp of his own future, play guitar for anyone who would listen. "We did good," Brennan said, echoing her words from years before. "We did really, really good." "We did," she agreed, "and I'd do it all over again in a heartbeat." As the sun set and the celebration moved inside, Brennan pulled Felicity aside to the spot where they'd first kissed by Clear Creek. The water still rushed over the same stones, the mountains still stood in silent witness, but they'd changed, marked by time and love and the life they'd shared. 30 years, he said, cupping her face in his hands the way he'd done 1,000 times before. 30 years of waking up beside you, of watching you with our children, of building a life I never dreamed possible. 30 years of being loved by you, she replied, her eyes shining with tears. Of being chosen every single day, of knowing I found my home. They kissed as the last light faded from the sky, as their family's laughter drifted down from the house, as the creek sang its eternal song. And in that moment, Brennan knew with absolute certainty that every lonely year, every moment of doubt and despair, had been worth it to arrive here in this life with this woman. The future stretched before them, full of promise and possibility. There would be more grandchildren, maybe even great-grandchildren if they were blessed with long enough lives. There would be challenges and sorrows, joys and triumphs. But through it all, they would have each other, the steady anchor that had kept them grounded through 3 decades of marriage. As they walked back to the house hand in hand, Brennan looked up at the sky and offered a silent prayer of thanks. He'd given up finding someone to share his life, had resigned himself to walking alone. But she'd appeared in the storm like an answer to prayer, and she'd given him everything he'd stopped letting himself want. A family, a home, a love that would last forever. And that, he thought as Felicity squeezed his hand and smiled up at him, was the greatest blessing of all.